Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jameline Titong Kaling, your reporter for this afternoon. My topic is all about survey research. Survey research. Survey research is also called descriptive research, uses instruments such as questionnaires and interviews to gather information from groups of individuals. Surveys permit the researcher to summarize the characteristics of different groups or to measure their attitudes and opinions towards some issue. Researchers in education and the social sciences use surveys widely. For example, an educational researcher might ask a group of parents about what kind of sex education program, if any, they believe schools should provide for middle school students. Types of surveys. Before initiating survey research, the investigator must determine the format that is most appropriate for the proposed investigation. Surveys are classified according to their focus and scope or according to their time frame for the data collection. Becoming familiar with the options enables the researcher to select the method that will provide the most useful data. Surveys classified according to focus and scope. A survey that covers the entire population of interest referred to a census, an example of which is the U.S. Census undertaken by the government every 10 years. In research, however, population does not refer to all the people of a country. The term population is used to refer to the entire group of individuals to whom the findings of a study apply. The researcher defines the specific population of interest. It is often difficult or even impossible for the researchers to study very large populations. Hence, they select a smaller portion, a sample of the population for the study. A survey that studies only a portion of the population is known as a sample survey. Survey may be confined to simple tabulation of tangibles such as what proportion of children ride school buses and the average class enrollment. The most challenging type of survey is one that seeks to measure intangibles such as attitudes, opinions, values, or other psychological and sociological constructs. In such study, you must bring to bear not only the skills involved in proper sampling, but also the skills involved in identifying or constructing appropriate measures and employing the scores and these measures to make meaningful statements about the constructs involved. Surveys classified on basis of their scope, census versus sample, and their focus, tangibles versus intangibles. The four categories emerge. Number 1. A census of tangibles. When you seek information about a small population, such as a single, and when the variables involved are concrete, there is little challenge in finding the required answers. If a school principal wants to know how many desks are in the school, how many children ride the school bus, or how many teachers have master's degrees, a simple count will provide the information. Because the principal can have all the confidence characteristic of perfect induction. Well-defined and ambiguous variables are being measured, and as long as the enumeration is accurate and honest, the principal can say without fear of contradiction, on the 1st of September, there were 647 children less in our school, or 65% of the present faculty has master's degrees. The strength of a census of this type lies in its irrefutability. Its weakness lies in its confinement to a single limited population at a single point in time. The information provided by such a census may be of immediate importance to a limited group, but typically such surveys add little to general body knowledge in education. 2. A census of intangibles. Suppose the school principal now seeks information about pupil achievement or aspirations, teacher morale, or parents' attitude towards school. The task will be more difficult because this census deals with constructs that are not directly observable but must be inferred from indirect measures. test scores and responses to questionnaires serve to approximate constructs such as knowledge and attitudes. The value of a census intangibles is largely a question of the extent to which the instruments used actually measure the construct of interest. Reasonably, good instruments are available for measuring aptitude and achievement in a variety of academic areas. Many other variables remain very difficult to measure because researchers lack instruments that can meaningfully measure the constructs involved. Many important questions in education have not been answered. 3. A sample survey of tangibles. When investigators seek information about large groups, the expense involved in carrying out a census is often prohibitive. Therefore, researchers use sampling techniques and use the information they collect from the sample to make inferences about the population as a whole. When sampling is done well, the inferences made concerning the population can be quite reliable. A classic example of a sample survey of tangibles is the Report on Equality of Educational Opportunities commissioned by the U.S. Department of Education and Welfare. Number 4. A sample survey of intangibles. The public of opinion polls are examples of studies measuring intangibles constructs. Opinion is not directly observable but must be inferred from responses made by the subjects to questionnaires or interviews. Surveys of intangibles are limited by the fact that the data researchers collect are only indirectly measuring the variables they are concerned about. The seriousness of this limitation depends on how well the observations measure the intangibles variable. The same survey may study tangibles and intangibles at the same time. The Survey on Equality of Educational Opportunities asked the students to answer questionnaires and administered intelligence and achievement tests in order to make inferences about social class, ability, and achievement, as well as the relationship of this variable to each other and to tangible variables in the study. Surveys classified according to the time dimension. Surveys are also classified according to the time of data collection. Longitudinal surveys and cross-sectional surveys. Number 1. Longitudinal surveys. Gather information at different points in time in order to study the changes over extended periods of time. There are 3 designs are used in longitudinal survey research. Panel studies. In the panel study, the same subjects are surveyed several times over an extended period of time. For example, a researcher studying the development of quantitative reasoning in elementary school children would select a sample of first graders and administer a measure of quantitative reasoning. Trend studies. A trend study differs from a panel study in that different individuals randomly drawn from the same general population are surveyed at intervals over a period of time. For example, researchers who have studied national trends in mathematics achievement sample middle school students at various intervals and measure their math performance. Cohort studies. In a cohort study, a specific population is followed over a length of time with different random samples studied at various points. Typically, a cohort group has age in common. For example, a school system might follow the high school graduating classes of 2004 over time and ask them questions about higher education, work experiences, attitudes, and so on. From all the list of all graduates, a random sample is drawn at different points in time, and data are collected from that sample. Thus, population remains the same during the study, but the individuals surveyed are different each time. 2. Cross-sectional survey. Study a cross-section sample of a population at a single point in time. In a longitudinal study of vocabulary development, for example, a researcher would compare a measure of first grade students' vocabulary in 2000 with one when they were 4th grade students in 2003 and 7th grade students in 2006. A cross-sectional study would compare the vocabulary skills of sample of children from grades 1, 4, and 7 in 2006. The cross-sectional survey is the method of choice if you want to gather data at one point in time. Longitudinal surveys are more time-consuming and expensive to conduct because the researcher must keep up with the subjects and maintain their cooperation over a long period of time. Cross-sectional surveys, in contrast, do not require years to complete. Hence, they are less expensive. A major disadvantage of the cross-sectional method is the chance difference between samples may seriously bias the results. Survey technique. The survey permits you to gather information from a large sample of people relatively quickly and inexpensively. Conducting a good survey, however, is not as easy as it might initially appear. It requires careful planning, implementation, and analysis if it is to yield reliable and valid information. 6 basic steps involved in survey research. 1. Planning. Survey research begins with a question that the researcher believes can be answered most appropriately by means of survey method. For example, how do elementary teachers feel about retaining students, and what is the extent of tobacco use among the high school students in this district are questions that a survey could answer. The research questions in survey research typically concern the beliefs, preferences, attitudes, or other self-reported behaviors of the people or respondents in the study. A literature review reveals what other researchers have learned about the question. 2. Defining the population. One of the first important steps is to define the population under study. To whom will you distribute the survey? The population may be quite large or it may be rather limited. Defining the population is essential for identifying the appropriate subjects to select and for knowing to whom the results can be generalized. Once the population has been defined, the researcher must obtain or construct a complete list of all individuals in the population. This list, called the sampling frame, can be very difficult and time-consuming to construct if such a list is not already available. 3. Sampling. Because researchers generally cannot survey an entire population, they select a sample from that population. It is very important to select a sample that will provide results similar to those that would have been obtained if the entire population had been surveyed. In other words, the sample must be representative of the population. The extent to which this happens depends on the way subjects are selected. The sampling procedure that is most likely to yield a representative sample is some form of probability sampling. Probability sampling permits you to estimate how far sample results are likely to deviate from the population values. 4. Constructing the instrument. A major task in survey research is constructing the instrument that will be used to gather the data from the sample. The 2 basic types of data gathering instruments are interviews and questionnaires. 5. Conducting the survey. Once the data gathering instrument is prepared, it must be field tested to determine if it will provide the desired data. Also included in this step are training the users of the instrument, interviewing subjects or distributing questionnaires to them, and verifying the accuracy of the data gathered. 6. Processing the data. The last step includes coding the data, statistical analysis, interpreting the results, and reporting the findings. Data gathering techniques. There are 2 basic data gathering techniques in survey research: interviews and questionnaires. Interviews involve some form of direct contact between the people in the same sample group and the interviewer, the researcher, or someone trained by the researcher who presents the questions to each person in the sample group and records their responses. When a questionnaire is used, the questions are sent to all the members of the sample group who record and return their responses to the questions. So here are the 10 given data gathering techniques. 1. Personal interviews. In personal interview, the interviewer reads the questions to the respondent in a face-to-face setting and record the answers. One of the most important aspects of the interview is its flexibility. The interviewer has the opportunity to observe the subject and the total situation in which he or she is responding. Questions can be repeated of their meanings explained in case they are not understood by the respondents. The interviewer can also press for additional information when a response seems incomplete or not entirely relevant. Response rate refers to the proportion of the selected sample that agrees to be interviewed or returns a completed questionnaire. Advantage is the control that the interviewer has over the order with which questions are considered. In some cases, it is very important that respondents not know the nature of latter questions because their responses to these questions may influence earlier responses. Disadvantages. The main disadvantage of the personal interview is that it is more expensive than the other survey methods. The selection and training of the interviewers, their salary, and their travel to the interview site make this procedure costly. Another disadvantage is the possibility of interviewer bias, which occurs when the interviewer's own feelings and attitudes or the interviewer's gender, race, age, and other characteristics influence the way questions are asked or interpreted. As a general rule, interviewers of the same ethnic, racial group get most accurate answers to race-related questions. Another problem is socially desirability bias, in which respondents want to please the interviewer by giving socially acceptable responses. They would not necessarily give an anonymous questionnaire. They may say what they think the interviewer wants to hear. 2. Focus groups. A specific category of interview is the focus groups. Several subjects are interviewed at the same time. An advantage of a focus group is that participants respond not only to the researcher but also to other participants and their responses. The interaction between participants usually reveals more about the subject's point of view than would be the case with a researcher-dominated interview. The focus group's interaction enables the researcher to see how subjects incorporate the viewpoints of the others in structuring their own understandings. Focus groups are often used in qualitative research. The researcher invites people who are interested in the same general topic to assemble to discuss it. They are assured that they will be free to express themselves in their own words and to respond not only to the researcher but also to other participants and their responses. In quantitative research, it is very difficult and often very expensive to assemble individuals who will gather in the same place at the same time to respond to the researcher's predetermined questions. 3. Telephone interviews. The telephone interview is popular and studies how that it compares quite favorably with face-to-face interviewing. Its major advantages are lower the cost and faster completion with relatively high response rates. Telephone interviews can be conducted over a relatively short time span with people scattered over a large geographic area. For example, national polling organizations often use the telephone to obtain nationwide opinions among voters near election time. Large-scale surveys in major cities often use the telephone instead of sending interviews into unsafe areas. Another advantage is that respondents have a greater feeling of anonymity and hence there may be less interviewer bias and social desirability than the personal interviews. The main disadvantage of telephone interview is that there is less opportunity for establishing rapport with the respondent than in a face-to-face situation. It takes a great deal of skill to carry out a telephone interview so that the valid results are obtained. The interviewee often finds it difficult to overcome the suspicions of the surprised respondents. Another limitation of telephone interviews is that complex questions are sometimes difficult for respondents to follow. Another disadvantage is that households without telephones, those with unlisted numbers, and those with cell phones only are automatically excluded from the survey, which may bias results. Other limitations of telephone surveys arise from new technology that may make it increasingly difficult to reach potential respondents by phone. Number 4. Computer-assisted telephone interviewing. Computer and telecommunication technology has been applied to telephone surveys. Wearing earphones, the interviewer sits at a computer while it randomly selects a telephone number and dials. When the respondent answers, the interviewer reads the first question that appears on the computer screen and types the answer directly into the computer. The computer program displays the next screen containing the next question, and so on through the entire survey. Using CATI saves a great deal of time. The surveyor can fill in forms on a computer screen or type answers to open-ended questions very quickly. The major advantage is that CATI software immediately formats responses into a data file as they are keyed in, which saves the researcher time usually spent in coding and manually transferring responses from paper into the computer for analysis. 5. Conducting the interview. Whether the interview is conducted in person or by telephone, the interviewer's main job is to ask questions in such a way as to obtain valid responses and record the responses accurately and completely. The task for the interviewer is to create atmosphere that will put the respondent at ease. The interviewer also has the responsibility of keeping the respondent's attention focused on the task and for keeping the interview moving along smoothly. Interviews can be more or less structured. In a less structured interview, the same questions are asked of all respondents, but the interview is more conversational and the interviewer has more freedom to arrange the order of the questions or to rephrase the questions. A structured interview schedule contains specific questions in a fixed order to be asked of all respondents, along with transition phrases and probes. Another important technique besides the probe is the pause. In a less structured interviews, any marked deviations from the protocol should be documented so that the information can be taken into account when analyzing the interviewer's response. The structured interview is the most widely used format for large studies with numerous interviewers. 6. Training the interviewer. It is essential that the potential interviewers receive training before being sent out to conduct interview. Quality of interviewers is probably one of the least appreciated aspects of survey research. Interviewers have a great deal of potential for influencing the quality of the data they collect. Fowler 2002, page 117. There are certain aspects of interviews that need to be standardized and therefore they should always be included in the interview training. 1. Procedures for contacting respondents and introducing the study. 2. Instruction on asking questions so that interviewers ask all questions in a consistent and standardized way. 3. Procedures for probing inadequate answers in a non-directive way. And 4. Procedures for recording answers to open-ended and closed-ended questions. 5. Rules for handling the interpersonal aspects of the interview in a non-biasing way. Fowler 2002. Interviewer trainees should be provided with written manuals on interviewing procedures. Number 7. Mailed questionnaires. The direct one-on-one contact with subjects in a personal interview is time-consuming and expensive often. Much of the same information can be obtained by means of a questionnaire mailed to each individual in the sample, with a request that he or she complete and return it by a given date. A mailed questionnaire has the advantage of guaranteeing confidentiality or anonymity, thus perhaps eliciting more truthful responses than would be obtained with a personal interview. Disadvantage of mailed questionnaire is the possibility of respondents misinterpreting the questions. It is extremely difficult to formulate a series of questions whose meanings are crystal clear to every reader. Another important limitation of mailed questionnaires is the low return rate. It is easy for the individual who receives a questionnaire to lay it aside and simply forget to complete and return it. A number of factors have been found to influence the rate of returns for mailed questionnaire, including 1. Length of the questionnaire, 2. Cover letter, 3. Sponsorship of the questionnaire, 4. Attractiveness of the questionnaire, and 5. Ease of completing it and mailing it back. 6. Interest aroused by the content. 7. Use of a monetary incentive, and 8. Follow-up procedures used. 8. Electronic mail surveys. As computers have become common, researchers have used electronic mail, email to deliver questionnaires. Dillman 2000 found that email surveys have the advantage of prompter returns, lower item non-response, and more complete answers to open-ended questions. Electronic mail surveys can be completed at a pace the respondent chooses, and they cannot be misled like a mail survey. The main advantage is that they are appropriate only when the researcher has email addresses for all members of a finite population. Research shows that some of the factors found to be important for regular mail surveys are also important for email surveys. For example, people who received prior email notification about the survey were more likely to respond. Also, surveys addressed individually to a person had higher response. 9. Internet surveys. The Internet has become a popular methodology for survey research. The questionnaire is placed on a website constructed by the investigator. Web-based surveys have a number of advantages. 1. They have potential of reaching large populations. 2. Permit the collection of larger amount of data than would be possible with traditional survey methods. 3. They can be conducted quickly and easily and are less expensive than mailed surveys. Another important benefit is in the processing of survey data. Web-based surveys can significantly reduce the amount of time and effort and the cost associated with getting the data into a system for analysis. The major limitation of Internet surveys is that samples are restricted to those with access to the technology and who choose to respond. There is somewhat conflicting evidence about response rates in web-based surveys. The consensus, however, is that response rates for web surveys are lower than rates obtained by other methods. Next, 10. Directly administered questionnaires. A directly administered questionnaire is given to a group of people assembled at a certain place for a specific purpose. Examples including surveying the freshmen or the parents attending summer orientation at a university. The main advantage of directly administering questionnaires is the high response rate, which typically is close to 100%. Other advantages are the low cost and the fact that the researcher is present to provide assistance or answer questions. The disadvantage is that the researcher is usually restricted in terms of where and when the questionnaire can be administered. Also, when a population is limited, the results of the survey will be equally limited in terms of generalizability. As we have seen, researchers have a choice among several data collection methods for survey research. They choose the one best suited for their particular study. However, a multi-mode approach in which researchers use combinations of these methods in the same study is quite common. In fact, Fowler 2002 states that mixing modes is one of the best ways to minimize survey non-response because it enables researchers to reach people who are inaccessible via a single mode. Table 14.1 Comparison of data collection methods. So this table shows the advantages and disadvantages of data collection methods. So this is all my report. Thank you for listening. God bless.